Hey everyone. This is a piece called Trotskyism, c'est moi. Tony Cliff's book, Trotskyism After Trotsky. Uh, it's a review by Paul Hampton. It opens with a quote. Quote, as in private life, one distinguishes between what a man thinks and says of himself and what he really is and does. Still more in historical struggles, one must distinguish the phrases and fancies of the parties from their real organism and their real interests, their conception of themselves from their reality. End quote. Karl Marx, the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. So here we go. This alleged history of Trotskyism after Trotsky is an exercise in self-aggrandisement by its author, Tony Cliff. Cliff's pamphlet is a slapdash, cut-and-paste job of old articles. Since this is myth-making and not political history, there is a great deal about the idiocies of the Cannon-Pablo-Mandel, quote, orthodox Trotskyists, but no mention of other, quote, unorthodox Trotskyists. In the first place, Shachtman and his comrades in the U.S. In the decade when Cliff was still a rational alternative, was still an orthodox Trotskyist, they developed the ideas of Trotsky's last period, initially in conflict with Trotsky himself, into a rational alternative to the, quote, orthodox Trotskyists who lost their way. Cliff was an, quote, orthodox Trotskyist on the USSR until 1947 to 48, and on key questions, Cliff remains in that tradition to this day. Bracket, for example, in his caricatural Cannonite / Zionoviest idea of the Revolutionary Party. End bracket. Cliff argues that Trotsky's four main prognoses at the end of his life turned out to be false. These were 1. That the Stalinist regime in Russia could not survive the war. 2. That capitalism was in terminal crisis, so there would be no expansion of production and therefore no prospect of social reforms. 3. That in backward, underdeveloped countries, according to the theory of permanent revolution, bourgeois democratic tasks such as national liberation could only be advanced by the working class. 4. That the Fourth International would quickly grow into the leading force of the international proletariat. All were mistaken. Stalinism not only survived the war but emerged stronger, expanded into further territory. Capitalism underwent its greatest period of economic expansion from 1950 to 1973, and new welfare and social reforms were fought for and won. In China, Cuba, and Vietnam, Stalinist regimes were created and there was a wave of decolonization and later capitalist economic development in parts of the so-called Third World. The, quote, Fourth International remained tiny. Cliff claims to have single-handedly provided the only Marxist explanations of the origin, development, and decline of Stalinism. Though Cliff's body of theory does contain some helpful insights, all of the ostentatious boasting here of Cliff's omniscience are not only ridiculous but simply false. Cliff even presents himself as the first state capitalist! Exclamation point. This myth-making booklet is the Socialist Workers' Party's equivalent of Pierre Franc's vacuous, quote, history of the Cannon-Pablo-Mandel, quote, Fourth International. New section, State Capitalism. Cliff's 1948 argument to prove that Russia was a, quote, bureaucratic state capitalism, end quote, has two disadvantages. It was both incoherent and not really a theory of state capitalism. Cliff says that the two main features of capitalism are the separation of the workers from the means of production and the transformation of labor power into commodity which the workers are forced to sell, and the accumulation of capital forced on capitalists by their competitive struggle. He says both of these features characterized the Soviet Union during the first five-year plan, 1928 to 1932. Popular consumption in the USSR was subordinated to accumulation. The USSR was organized like a single capitalist enterprise. The competitive dynamic was provided by military competition and Western capitalism. Cliff wrote, quote, "In order to see whether labor power in Russia is really a commodity, as it is under traditional capitalism, it is necessary to see what specific conditions are necessary for it to be so." Bracket, Cliff quotes Marx, end bracket, ... "If there is only one employer, a, quote, change of masters, end quote, is impossible. And the, quote, periodic sale of himself, end quote, becomes a mere formality. The contract also becomes only a formality when there are many sellers and only one buyer. That even this formal side of the contract is not observed in Russia is clear from the system that even this formal side of the contract is not observed in Russia is clear from the system of fines and punishments, the quote, corrective labor, end quote, and so on, end quote." Cliff, State Capitalism in Russia. Logically, for Cliff in 1948, labor power in Russia is not and cannot be a commodity. Cliff's pupils were explicit. Binns and Haynes, for example, wrote 30 years later that, quote, "labor power cannot be a commodity in the USSR because with only one company, parenthesis, USSR Limited, end parenthesis, purchasing it, there cannot be a genuine labor market," end quote. Binns and Haynes, 1979. Cliff in 1999 ignores this question. In 1948, Cliff wrote of the law of value, quote, "Hence, if one examines the relations within the Russian economy, abstracting them from their relations with the world economy, one is bound to conclude that the source of the law of value, as the motor and regulator of production, is not to be found in it. In essence, the laws prevailing in the relations between the enterprises and between the laborers and the employer state would be no different if Russia were one big factory, managed directly from one center, and if all the laborers received the goods they consumed directly, in kind," end quote. Cliff. By what mechanism, then, is the USSR capitalist? Recognizing the virtual absence of trade between Stalin's USSR and Western capitalism, Cliff argued, quote, "because international competition takes mainly a military form, the law of value expresses itself in its opposite, viz. a striving after use values," end quote. Cliff. But there is nothing specifically capitalist about military competition. Marxists analyze and categorize class societies by the specific economic form in which surplus labor is pumped out of the direct producers. Under capitalism, as distinct from feudalism and ancient slave labor societies, by the exploitation of formally and legally free wage labor by capital under conditions of free sale of labor power, workers and capitalists appear to meet and trade as equals, an illusion of equality which was one aspect of what Marx called, quote, "the fetishism of the commodities," end quote. The quote, "fetishism of commodities," end quote. Marx's starting point in Capital was the essential contradiction within the commodity, between the commodity's use value and exchange value, between the natural use and the social exchange form of the products of labor. Capitalists do not accumulate ever more varied kinds of wealth in its natural form or engage in military competition. Capitalists accumulate wealth in a specific social form, money as capital. What matters for a capitalist is not whether they accumulate tanks or tractor factories or Black Sea villas. What matters is the accumulation of ever-expanding amounts of money. A capitalist for Marx is someone for whom, quote, "the circulation of money as capital is an end in itself. For the valorization of value takes place only within this constantly renewed movement, bracket, money commodity, money prime, end bracket. As the conscious bearer of this movement, the possessor of money becomes a capitalist. The possessor of money, the capitalist person, or rather the capitalist pocket, is the point from which the capitalist money starts and to which the capitalist money returns. End quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 1. Whatever can be said of Cliff's theory, one thing Cliff didn't demonstrate is how the, quote, accumulation of means of production and of destruction by the Stalinist bureaucracy was driven by the circulation of money as capital, as an end in itself. Even in retrospect, Cliff does not believe that these and other fundamental tendencies of capitalism operate in the USSR. Cliff's, quote, state capitalism was a capitalism without commodity fetishism. Capitalists are the accumulation of money as capital. It was never anything more than a label in search of a theory. Arms production in Russia, Cliff says, explains why it did not suffer from the cycle of boom and slump. In a somewhat gentle review of the first 1955 book version of Cliff's work on Russia, Hal Draper in 1956 wrote that, quote, state capitalist, end quote, theory sometimes shades into versions which make it virtually identical to our own, bracket, that the USSR is a bureaucratic collectivist state, a distinctive form of class society, end bracket. This tends to happen where the, quote, state capitalism, unquote, is ... is labeled as hyphenated capitalism only as a matter of terminological taste. Cliff's analysis does not begin that way, but it tends to wind up so, end quote. I guess that review is available in Workers' Liberty 49, 1998. Cliff calls Russia state capitalist, but what Cliff describes is not a capitalist society, exclamation point. Cliff's basic syllogism was faulty. Such and such occurs in the Eastern Bloc. The same happens in the West. The West is capitalist, therefore the Eastern Bloc is capitalist. As far back as Aristotle, serious thinkers have understood that, though analogy can be very illuminating, reasoning by analogy, as if distinct things with common traits were fully identical, is necessarily fallacious. As a side note, that was one of a rhetorical favorite of Leon Trotsky. Reasoning by analogy. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Reasoning by analogy, as if analogy is identity, Cliff assumed what needed to be proved: the existence of capital and a capitalist class. Impermissibly, he redefined the dynamic of capitalism as the competition of use values in the production of armaments. This grasped neither the essence of capitalism as a world system, nor the origin and development of Stalinism. Joseph Carter made the same point against Cliff's unacknowledged predecessor with a state capitalist analysis of the USSR, C.L.R. James, in 1942, when he wrote, quote, "It is the, quote, specific manner, end quote, in which the factors of production are united. This specific way in which surplus value is extracted from the working class, surplus labor is extracted from the working class, that differentiates bureaucratic collectivism from capitalism," end quote. That's from a piece by Carter titled Aspects of Marxist Economics. I want to read that. Carter. Aspects of... Yeah. Cliff doesn't even bother to acknowledge and evaluate attempts by his pupils to develop his state capitalist theory. In 1980, Duncan Hollis wrote against Binns and Haynes that, quote, "If labor power is not a commodity in the USSR, then there is no proletariat. Moreover, if labor power is not a commodity, then there can be no wage/labor relationship, and therefore no capital either. Therefore, there can be no capitalism in any shape or form," end quote. Duncan Hollis. Alex Kalinikos argued that labor power was a commodity in the USSR because enterprises did compete for workers. correcting Cliff's, quote, obscure and, quote, misleading account. And Derek Howe wrote that the law of value did apply to the internal workings of the USSR. Such a debate among the Socialist Workers' Party mandarinate was surely needed, yet none of this is even mentioned in Cliff's review of the history of the theory. This is because to argue that all of the laws of private capitalism applied to Russia would junk virtually all that was distinctive in Cliff in 1948. Cliff's merit in 1948 over Trotsky's, quote, workers' state epigons lay only in the insistence that this was an exploitative class society. Many others had already said that, and not only in theories of state capitalism, and continued to say it. Cliff's specific ideas were worthless mystifications. There can be no greater proof of that than the fundamental modifications, bracket, above, and bracket, his, quote, school had to make to the 1948 Cliff. Socialist Workers' Party, quote, state capitalism, end quote, is reduced to a general label behind which there are conflicting versions of the elements that make up the theory. Who was it said sects change their doctrines more readily than they change their names? Cliff argues that the changes in Eastern Europe in the 90s can only be seen as a, quote, move sideways, a change, quote, within the mode of production, end quote, because it was accomplished so easily, without revolutionary violence or a wholesale change of either the ruling class or the state. Those who believe a more profound change has taken place were revising the Marxist theory of the state. This is the eclectic Cliff using arguments long cherished by upholders of the workers' state position. It is true that the working class cannot seize power without smashing the old bourgeois state machine, and that once in power politically, it cannot be supplanted without a counter-revolution, crucially by the smashing of the democratic organs of workers' self-rule, that is, the working class character of the state, the Soviets, parenthesis, and the Marxist leadership, end parenthesis. This is what Stalin accomplished after 1928. And this is, in my opinion, very much the problem with all Trotskyist accounts of the USSR, is that the view that the democratic character of the USSR, the working class democratic character of the USSR, was not substantially decimated much earlier. Anyway, the socialist revolution is qualitatively different from previous revolutions in that the workers must take and hold power consciously in the workers' own interests. The bourgeoisie do not necessarily have to rule politically in order to rule socially and economically, nor did they in fact come to power in most cases through revolution. France after 1789 was of course a crucial exception. In most cases, the German Bismarckian road to power is the dominant form of bourgeois revolution, where a section of the old ruling class facilitated the introduction of capitalism from above. When all sorts of formations have made bourgeois revolutions in the past, why should this pattern not unfold in Russia and elsewhere in the current period? New section. The permanent arms economy. Cliff's most ridiculous piece of self-aggrandisement here is the claim to have originated the theory of, quote, permanent arms economy, end quote, which Cliff says explained both the extent and the limits of the post-war capitalist boom between 1950 and 1973. Cliff claims that the theory of the permanent arms economy avoided both the capitalism is about to experience another great slump, catastrophism, typical for decades of, quote, orthodox Trotskyism, and the endless optimism of Keynesian economists. Here Cliff repeats the idea that the basic cause of capitalist crisis is the relatively low purchasing power of the masses compared to the productive capacity of industry, quote, underconsumptionism, end quote, so that periodically goods are produced which cannot be sold. Capitalism avoids permanent slump by cycles of investment in capital goods. Capital goods will eventually produce consumer goods. The massive increase in the armaments expenditure by some imperialist states such as the US and Britain, beginning with World War I and continuing from the 30s through to the Second World War into the Cold War, worked to counteract this tendency. Arms production, unlike means of production department one production of machines, makes goods that never produce department two consumer goods dependent on the mass market. It allowed for both investment and consumption to grow for an unprecedented period after 1945. However, in fact, other states such as Germany and Japan, defeated in World War II, gained a competitive advantage from not enduring the heavy burden of arms expenditure, and this eventually reintroduced the classic boom-slump cycle of earlier capitalism. Cliff says that his 1948 analysis of Russia contains the germ of the permanent arms economy theory, military competition between Russia and the West. But in fact, Cliff only formulated his PAE, permanent arms economy theory, in 1957 in a short article titled Permanent Arms Economy, published in neither Washington nor Moscow in 1982. As always, Cliff, who knows no shame on these matters, fails to acknowledge his intellectual debts here to the real originators of this theory. Paul Sweezy, who, with Leo Huberman, edited the Soft Stalinist Journal Monthly Review, amen to that, and Ed Sard, who wrote under the pseudonym of Frank Demby, Walter S. Oakes, and T.N. Vance. The U.S. Shachtmanite bi-monthly magazine New International carried a book-length series of articles signed by T.N. Vance throughout 1951. There are elements of the arms economy thesis in Luxemburg and Bukharin, imperialism and world economy before the 1940s. But Paul Sweezy formulated the essence of Cliff's view in 1942 in his book, The Theory of Capitalist Development. Sweezy argued that the rise of militarism had serious consequences for capitalism. Sweezy argued that the rise of militarism had serious consequences for capitalism. Firstly, the rise of militarism fostered the development of a special group of capitalists in the steel and shipbuilding industries and the munitions magnates who produced the armaments. Secondly, arms spending offsets the tendency towards underconsumptionism. And finally, permanent production offers a profitable field for the investment of capital. Sweezy, Tard, c'est moi. I think I'm actually finally, I feel like an idiot, but I think I'm finally actually getting the title now. C'est moi means I am, or that's me, which is like, the sun god, Louis the 14th, I believe, he said, I am the state. And it's like, l'état c'est moi, or something like that, which means the state, I am. And I think it means, the title of this means Trotskyism, I am. Maybe I'm misreading that, I don't know. Anyway, back to the text. Ed Sard developed, quote, Cliff's theory of the arms economy, marshalling the data to illustrate it. Ed Sard defined a war economy as, quote, whenever the government's expenditure for war, or, quote, national defense, end quote, becomes a legitimate and significant end purpose of economic activity, end quote. Ed Sard. Published in 1944 in Dwight MacDonald's magazine Politics. The state could address the problem of what he called, quote, excess accumulated unpaid labor, end quote, capital, by war outlays, parenthesis, equal to around 10% of national income, end parenthesis, or by public works. In his 1951 New International article, Ed Sard added rapid capital accumulation, a huge national debt and interest burden, Bonapartist tendencies, bracket, the state rising to a position of command over society, end bracket, and military economic imperialism to these basic characteristics of the, quote, new epoch, end quote. Both Sweezy's and Sard's theories had a heavy Keynesian twist. So did Cliff. Cliff defined the basic cause of capitalist crisis as underconsumption. Cliff argued that arms alone was the, quote, great stabilizing factor for contemporary capitalist prosperity, end quote. Cliff added that by undercutting workers' living standards, encouraging developments in technology, and facing competition on the world market, the permanent arms economy would undermine itself. Cliff, quote, with the huge strides of Russian industry, it is possible that in another 10 or 20 years, Russia may, even if Russia does not reach the absolute level of United States industry, at least challenge the United States and the world market in certain branches, those of heavy industry, end quote. Cliff. While, quote, underconsumptionism, in the sense argued by Sweezy and Cliff, might play some role in explaining crises, it does not do so directly. Capitalists can have an adequate market for what they produce even when wages are very low. Demand for capitalists and their hangers-on for new machinery, equipment, materials, and luxuries can make up the market. Low living standards for workers alongside vast luxury for capitalists make us angry, but they do not necessarily cause trouble for capitalism. I really like that sentence. I'm going to repeat it. Low living standards for workers alongside vast luxury for capitalists make us angry, but they do not necessarily cause trouble for capitalism. It is not clear what, quote, under means here. At what level does the worker's share have to fall to cause a crisis? Marx himself wrote, as well as the usual quotation produced by the underconsumptionist, that, quote, it is pure tautology to say that crises are provoked by a lack of effective demand or effective consumption. The capitalist system does not recognize any other forms of consumer than those who can pay, ... The fact that commodities are unsaleable means no more than that no effective buyers have been found for them, ... End quote. Marx, Capital Volume 2. Armaments production may act as a stabilizer, as some sort of replacement market, but it will only be a precondition for the expansion of capital, not its prime determinant. As Phil Semp, referring to the period 1937 to 42, put it, quote, it is not arms as such which increases the profits, but the recovery which increased arms production stimulated, end quote. Phil Semp. Just a background, like if you don't know, this kind of like the whole idea of, and it's of Keynesianism. That's part of sometimes why you hear the phrase, the concept of like military Keynesianism. To my understanding, the basis of Keynesianism is to have like a counter-cyclical economic policy during that counteracts the worst effects of the business cycle, right? So when the business cycle is at a peak boom, you increase taxes, and you decrease spending, right? And then once the boom is over, you decrease taxes and increase spending. So that if you say if you increase spending, say the government starts, say like needs things for like, say military arms, it'll purchase arms from an arms contractor. And what the armed contractor is going to do is it's going to hire a bunch of people. Those people are going to have needs which can be catered to by all different kinds of businesses that cater to consumption needs of the workers. These businesses will depend upon, will be able to purchase capital goods in order to produce these consumer goods. So the idea is that government spending is going to, quote, prime the pump, right, and get the economy back on its feet so it can reach another boom in which which will again return to high taxes and low government spending. So, at least that's my understanding of what the whole Keynesian hypothesis is, and it's kind of like the idea is not like, it's necessarily that like the particular industry that the state decides to invest in is or purchase things from is it's not like about just necessarily about the growth of that particular area of the economy that the state purchases things from, but the kind of like trickle down effects of that investment, right? And you can think of that very much well. I mean, I'm sure, I don't know where you live, but at least in the part of America where I live, and I think this is kind of everywhere, it's like, whole parts of the area were kind of like built around like the spending that transpired during the New Deal, and also the spending that happened in World War II and the post World War II period. Like whole areas are kind of developed around some kind of arms manufacturer or like some kind of military base or some kind of like thing that the government put money into, and that kind of like created a whole kind of private economy around this area where government funds were deployed. So I think that's a kind of like that's kind of like the gist of what this this idea is about. Anyway, Cliff's old view, presented here once again, much as in 1957, was riddled with problems. Cliff's disciple, Chris Harman, in Chris Harman's book on crisis, says Cliff's errors were a matter of his form of presentation. In language explicable to Keynesian economists, this begs the question why Cliff would make so many concessions to this milieu, rather present his theory in its, quote, real Marxist form. New section, Kidron. Michael Kidron's development of the permanent arms economy, which argued that arms might have offset the tendency for the rate of profit to fall, quote, perhaps permanently, end quote, bracket, Western capitalism since the war, 1967, end bracket, fared little better. As late as 1967, Kidron argued that the signs of instability were merely, quote, spots on the horizon, end quote. In fact, Kidron's model of capitalism is a closed economy with leaks, export of capital, wars, slumps, and luxury goods production such as armaments, bracket, as set out in IS 36, quote, Maginot Marxism, end quote, end bracket, is still far from a consistent Marxist analysis. The concept of a, quote, closed system is nonsense if it means a single capitalist country, and a false starting point for an analysis of capitalism, which is an international system. Kidron's, quote, leaks are in fact integral to capitalism, as Marx's discussion of luxury goods, parenthesis, Department 3, end parenthesis, indicates. In his arithmetic, Kidron allows for changes on the organic composition of capital, constant capital divided by variable capital, or the amount of capital that goes into means of production broadly conceived, and the capital that's invested in wages, to take place in this sector without affecting the overall rate of profit. Like Cliff, Kidron fails to register that arms still have to be paid for out of total social product, a deduction which, like other forms of state expenditure, the bourgeoisie have been keen to reduce, especially since the crisis broke in 1973. Chris Harman has tried to put a square circle around this muddle, but all Harman's accumulated empirical material cannot hide the flaws in the basic arguments. An explanation of boom and slump in the wider context of the whole circuit of capital can therefore incorporate the role which arms expenditure played before 1914, and especially after 1945, in prolonging the boom, the technological innovations brought about by the pressure of war, and the wholesale replacement of old means of production by American technology undoubtedly gave a boost to the development of productive forces. But this was part of a wider feature of the post-war world, the increased role of the state. Any explanation of the boom would also have to include the, quote, imperialism of free trade, end quote, under U.S. domination, the role of the dollar and other international financial arrangements, and so on. By isolating a department of arms production, one useful insight, one cannot explain the post-war boom. Cliff unintentionally recognizes that the, quote, arms economy alone cannot explain the onset of crisis after 1973, when Cliff points to the competition for non-military capitalisms, Germany and Japan, in precipitating this downturn. Cliff dares not stretch the, quote, arms economy theory to the present crisis. This article is from... I'm not sure what this article is from. Anyway, if the arms economy were so essential to the last 100 years of imperialism, to a new stage of capitalism, then what is the nature of the present epoch? Kidron, of course, drew these conclusions even earlier within Cliff's tradition, claiming that the post-war world was a new epoch altogether, a new higher stage of capitalism. But these confusions are best dealt with under Cliff's final theoretical edifice, the deflected permanent revolution. New section, deflected permanent revolution. Cliff's 1963 theory about developments in the, quote, third world, known as, quote, deflected permanent revolution, purported to explain the emergence of third world Stalinism, that is what he called, quote, bureaucratic state capitalism, end quote. Cliff argues that where the bourgeoisie cannot carry through a bourgeois revolution, if the working class is not revolutionary because of Stalinism and reformism, the outcome will not, as in Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution, be workers' power, but Stalinism. This account of developments in the third world where some regimes took Russian Stalinism as a model of development, is of course only as good as Cliff's theory of state capitalism. The collapse of Stalinism has dealt it a shattering blow. China is still a Stalinist hybrid, but essentially Cliff's theory of third world Stalinism is now only an intellectual curiosity. The most profound problem with Cliff's state capitalist version of permanent revolution is Cliff's failure to disentangle the various elements of the bourgeois revolution which were knotted up in permanent revolution. Thus, while the Socialist Workers' Party has moved on from Lenin's conception of imperialism, they appear to have stuck to a very narrow conception of the national question derived from the Second Congress of the Comintern in 1920. In fact, Lenin's wider argument on the right of nations to self-determination and the Bolshevik championing of the rights for national minorities as the best means to unite workers divided by national antagonisms seems to have been completely lost. Instead, the Socialist Workers' Party indulges in precisely the kind of two-camp, quote, anti-imperialism of idiots, end quote, that their earlier theories attempted to avoid. New section, the house that Cliff built. The measure of any revolutionary socialist political tendency is its intervention in the living class struggle. The record of the Socialist Workers' Party is that of a tendency that has often been distant from some of the core conceptions of the tradition of Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Trotsky. On the issue of capitalist integration in the European Union, they jumped on the Little Englander bandwagon. On the national question in Ireland, they have failed to provide a program to unite Catholic and Protestant workers on the basis of consistent democracy, which recognizes their respective rights as national minorities. Parentheses, the Catholics within the unviable Northern Statelet, the Protestants within the whole of Ireland, in parentheses, some form of federalism. On Israel-Palestine, Cliff's group combines a recognition of the legitimate rights of Palestinians to their own state with a shrill anti-Zionism which effectively argues that the Jews do not have national rights in Palestine. As the Jewish people appear to be the only nation denied this right to self-determination, this argument is dangerously close to anti-Semitism. Far from learning from Lenin on these two questions, the Socialist Workers' Party appear to have a notion of, quote, good and, quote, bad peoples. Some have more rights than others. The worst mistakes on imperialism have undoubtedly been their assessment of the Gulf Wars. In 1987, having assessed the Iran-Iraq War since 1980 as a war between rival sub-imperialisms, the presence of U.S. ships in the region led the Socialist Workers' Party to, quote, militarily support, end quote, Iran because of the, quote, intervention of imperialism, end quote. Then, after Iraq had seized Kuwait in 1990, they flirted with critical support for Saddam. Quote, socialists must hope that Iran gives the U.S. a bloody nose and that the U.S. is frustrated in its attempt to force the Iraqis out of Kuwait, ... end quote. Socialist Worker, 18th of August 1990. Only later did the Socialist Workers' Party sober up and analyze the war as a conflict between U.S. imperialism and its allies and the ambitious sub-imperialism, Iraq. Ensnared by his own contradictions, Cliff repeatedly falls back on one argument, that socialism is about the self-emancipation of the working class. This means socialists should champion working class independence. Even here, Cliff's record is very bad. In South Africa in the 80s, this issue was posed sharply: how to break the unions, COSATU, from the political domination of the ANC in the struggle against apartheid. Some socialists, including our own tendency, argue that the COSATU should form a labor party to fight for the interests of workers. The Socialist Workers' Party disagreed but offered no strategy in its place. When in the presidential elections in 1994 the same issue came up, the workers' list stood against Mandela and de Klerk and put forward working class demands. But the Socialist Workers' Party swung in behind Mandela, so much for promoting working class independence. This book glorifies Cliff's theories, which he says generated the politics of the Socialist Workers' Party. If that is so, then they would have little to recommend them, even if they were far more coherent than they ever were. Cliff never had a coherent theory of the Eastern Bloc, but a label underneath which the politics wavered opportunistically. The Socialist Workers' Party believed that, quote, state capitalism was the next phase of capitalist development and did not anticipate or explain the terminal decline of Stalinism in the late 80s. In reality, Cliff's theories explained very little. The politics of the group are and were shaped and reshaped mainly by catchpenny opportunism. What does catchpenny mean? Let's see if my internet works. And it doesn't. There is tremendous potential for Marxists in the present period, and accounting for past analyses is indeed part of the role of theory as a guide to action in the living struggle. False, boastful, factionally fabricated, quote, history is no use at all. The book, Tony Cliff, Trotskyism After Trotsky, The Origins of the International Socialists, published in 1999. Workers' Liberty, number 55, April 1999.